Kenneth Eugene Smith spent 28 years waiting for the state of Alabama to end his life. On January 25, 2024, that moment finally came, and history was made. He became the first person in the world to be executed with nitrogen gas, a method never before tested on a human being. But this story doesn't begin in the execution chamber. It started decades earlier, when a respected preacher in Alabama set into motion a plan that would destroy his family and claim his wife's life. In 1988, Reverend Charles Sennett stood as a well-known preacher in northwestern Alabama. To the community, he was a man of God. However, his private life told a different story. He was drowning in tens of thousands of dollars in debt, carrying on an affair, and watching his world collapse. Afraid of exposure and humiliation, Charles turned to a desperate plan: eliminate his wife, Elizabeth Dorene Sennett, a 45-year-old mother of two. With her gone, he could collect on an insurance policy and buy himself more time. Charles recruited a tenant of his, Billy Gray Williams, to arrange the killing. Williams then brought in two young men to carry it out: Kenneth Smith, only 22 at the time, and John Forrest Parker. The arrangement was straightforward and cold. Each man would receive $1,000 for Elizabeth's death. On the morning of March 18, 1988, Elizabeth was at her Colbert County home. That's when Smith and Parker came to the door. They pretended to be hunters and told her that Charles had permitted them to scout the land. Suspicious, Elizabeth called her husband. Charles reassured her it was fine, without revealing that he himself had paid the men to kill her. What Elizabeth couldn't have known was that the two men had already spent the money her husband had provided for a gun on drugs. With no firearm, they decided to improvise. Elizabeth let them inside. After walking around the property, they returned and asked if they could use the bathroom. Still unaware of the danger, she agreed. As Parker stepped inside, Smith suddenly attacked her from behind. The assault escalated instantly. Elizabeth resisted with all the strength she had, but the men were brutal and unrelenting. They struck her with whatever was within reach: a fireplace poker, a wooden cane, even a piece of pipe. Finally, they resorted to a 6-inch survival knife, stabbing her repeatedly. 8 wounds marked the final stage of the vicious attack. Sheriff Ronnie May was among the first to arrive at the Sennett residence. He found Elizabeth on the floor, her body battered and broken, barely clinging to life. To his touch, there was no pulse. Yet when paramedics arrived moments later, they managed to find the faintest sign. For a short time, hope flickered that she might survive. But at the hospital, doctors confirmed what May had already feared: Elizabeth Sennett was gone. Later, the sheriff would remember her final moments in haunting words: "She fought it, and she fought hard." As detectives looked around, the scene didn't make sense. The house bore almost no trace of the violent struggle that had just taken place. Only a few items, a video cassette recorder and a stereo, had been taken. More valuable possessions had been left untouched. To investigators, it looked staged, a false robbery meant to cover up something far more sinister. Within a week, a call came into Crime Stoppers naming the men involved. On March 25, just 7 days after Elizabeth's murder, Charles Sennett himself was brought in for questioning. He denied everything. But when an investigator casually asked whether he knew Kenneth Smith, his face flushed red, betraying his composure. After the interview, Charles drove straight to his church. There, he confessed to his sons and their families, admitting both his affair and his role in arranging Elizabeth's death. Minutes later, he walked outside into the parking lot, sat in his truck, and ended his own life with a gunshot. But his suicide didn't end the case. Police obtained a warrant and searched Kenneth Smith's home. Inside, they found a video cassette recorder taken from the Sennett residence. When confronted, both Smith and John Parker admitted details that tied them directly to Elizabeth's killing. There was no escaping it now. For a mere $1,000, Kenneth Eugene Smith had taken part in a crime that would not only destroy the Sennett family but also set him on a path that ended in Alabama's most controversial execution. Kenneth Smith's legal battle stretched on for decades. In 1989, he was first convicted and sentenced to die, but 3 years later, that ruling was overturned. His case returned to court in 1996. At that second trial, the jury voted 11-1 in favor of life without parole. Yet under Alabama law at the time, judges had the authority to override jury recommendations. The judge chose death instead. Smith's co-defendants followed different paths, but none escaped grim endings. John Forrest Parker, who had joined him in the killing, was executed by lethal injection in 2010. Billy Gray Williams, the middleman who arranged the contract, died behind prison walls in 2020 from illness. That left Smith, who continued to appeal his sentence repeatedly. Each effort failed. By November 2022, the state of Alabama was prepared to carry out its execution by lethal injection. The night turned chaotic. His lawyers were still filing appeals as prison officials walked him toward the death chamber. Smith felt the sharp puncture of a needle as technicians tried to find a vein. He told them they were missing and pushing into muscle, but they pressed forward anyway. He was strapped down in what he later described as an inverted crucifixion, his arms forced upward, his body twisted uncomfortably. Minutes dragged on. The team left, then returned with syringes containing an unidentified substance. At 10:20 p.m., the U.S. Supreme Court lifted the stay, clearing the execution to move forward. But still, the team couldn't locate a usable vein. They jabbed him again and again, even into his collarbone, attempting to place a central line. The pain was unbearable. By 11:20 p.m., after more than an hour of failed attempts, Alabama called it off. Smith was left sweating heavily, struggling to breathe, too weak to raise his arms. He had come within minutes of dying, only for the night to end in collapse. It became the state's third botched execution in a row. Public backlash was swift. Governor Kay Ivey ordered a review, but behind closed doors, officials began considering a different approach. In 2023, Attorney General Steve Marshall asked the court to set a new date. This time, he did not request lethal injection. Instead, he pushed for a method never before used: nitrogen hypoxia. The concept sounded simple but carried chilling implications. Place a mask over the prisoner's face, remove oxygen, and replace it with pure nitrogen until the body shuts down. Supporters claimed it would be quick and painless. Critics labeled it dangerous, untested, and potentially cruel. The United Nations went further, warning that it could violate human rights. Still, Alabama courts gave the green light. Smith's execution was scheduled for January 25, 2024. That morning, inside Holman Correctional Facility, he sat in his cell, wide awake at 58 years old, having spent more than half his life on death row. His final meal was steak, hash browns, and eggs, eaten quietly. He later spent precious hours with his wife and sons, each word carrying the weight of goodbye. As evening approached, his spiritual advisor, Reverend Jeff Hood, prayed with him. Hood later said Smith was calm but deeply uneasy about what was coming. At 7:53 p.m., guards escorted him into the chamber. Straps tightened across his wrists, ankles, and chest. A full face mask was sealed over him. On the other side of the glass, witnesses took their seats, including members of Elizabeth Sennett's family. When asked for final words, Smith spoke clearly. "Tonight, Alabama causes humanity to take a step backwards. Thank you for supporting me. Love all of you." Moments later, nitrogen began to flow. Witnesses described him thrashing and straining against the restraints, gasping for breath. For several minutes, the sound of his desperate breathing filled the room before it slowed. At 8:15 p.m., the curtain closed. By 8:25 p.m., Kenneth Eugene Smith was pronounced dead, the first person in history executed by nitrogen hypoxia. The reaction was immediate. Human rights groups condemned Alabama's decision. The United Nations called it cruel and degrading. Yet the state defended its actions. Only months later, Alan Eugene Miller became the second person to die this way. Other states began looking at nitrogen executions as well. But history will always remember Smith as the first, the man who survived a botched lethal injection only to face an experimental method of death. For Elizabeth Sennett's family, justice had finally come after 36 long years. For the wider world, Smith's death opened a new and troubling chapter in America's death penalty. This case stands as a grim reminder of the consequences of greed, secrecy, and desperation. One preacher's decision to silence his wife rippled outward, destroying lives, testing the justice system, and ultimately making history. It shows how one act of betrayal can echo through families, communities, and even across nations. Every story we share isn't only about crime. It's about the choices that lead to destruction, the ripple effects of betrayal, and the people left behind in the aftermath. If you want more true crime stories that go deeper than the headlines, don't just watch, be part of the community. Hit subscribe, turn on the notification bell, and join us as we uncover these cases together.